All right, let's get into it. There's a new bill making waves on Capitol Hill right now, and it's sparking a huge debate about the very rules of our federal elections. It's called the SAVE Act, and it's forcing a really important conversation about who gets to vote and what they need to prove to do it. And really, this whole massive debate, it all boils down to one pretty straightforward question. Should you have to prove you're a U.S. citizen before you cast a ballot in a federal election? How you answer that pretty much decides which side of this issue you're on. So, to really get what this debate is all about, first things first, we have to understand what the SAVE Act actually proposes. Let's break it down. Okay, so the official name is the Safeguard American Voter Eligibility Act, or SAVE Act for short. The idea is pretty simple. It would create a new national rule for anyone voting in a federal election, for president, Congress, the Senate, and you'd have to show two things, a photo ID and separate proof that you're a U.S. citizen. Think a birth certificate or a passport. All right, so to understand the whole picture, let's start with the perspective of those who are pushing for this bill. We're going to look at the case made by one of its biggest supporters, Republican Congressman Brandon Gill. For Congressman Gill and a lot of the bill's supporters, this isn't just about changing a rule. Not at all. For them, this is about a core foundational principle. The central idea is that the right to vote in American elections should belong exclusively to American citizens. Period. So, you might be asking, why is this happening right now? Well, according to Congressman Gill, it comes down to a few key things. First, he calls it an issue of national sovereignty, the basic idea that a country gets to control its own rules and elections. Second, he says it's about protecting the actual power and weight of a citizen's vote. And third, he connects the need for this bill directly to his claim that more than 15 million undocumented immigrants have come into the country over the last 4 years.
This quote, it really gets to the absolute heart of their argument. The way Congressman Gill frames it, a non-citizen voting isn't just against the rules. He says it's an act that actively waters down, or basically cancels out the vote of a legal U.S. citizen. In his view, that's a kind of disenfranchisement of citizens themselves.
Now, as you can probably guess, this bill is running into a solid wall of opposition. From the Democratic perspective, this is a solution looking for a problem. They argue that non-citizen voting is already illegal, and the data shows it's incredibly rare. Their biggest concern? That this bill would actually create major hurdles for eligible citizens who might have a tough time getting all the required documents together. And, well, you really can't get any more blunt than that. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer isn't leaving any room for interpretation here. When he says dead on arrival, it shows just how firm the opposition is. For them, this is a non-starter, and it sets the stage for a major political battle. Now, this is where it gets really interesting, seeing how Congressman Gill describes the motivations on both sides. He lays out the Republican goals as being all about security, sovereignty, and protecting the vote. But then, he claims the Democratic opposition is really a strategic play for power. He alleges that their end goal is to let non-citizens vote to build a future base of Democratic voters. Now, it's super important to remember, this is his interpretation of their strategy, not what Democrats themselves have stated as their goal. Okay, so we've got a classic standoff between the House and the Senate. But what do everyday people think about all this? And what's the game plan for supporters to try and break through that Senate roadblock? Whoa, okay, take a look at this number. 83%. According to a nonpartisan poll from the Pew Research Center, that's the percentage of Americans who think people should have to show a government-issued photo ID to vote. Now, we have to be really clear here. This poll was about photo ID specifically, not the extra proof of citizenship requirement in the SAVE Act. Still, it does suggest that there's really broad public support for the general idea of stricter voter verification. So, with the Senate basically saying no way, what's the playbook? How do supporters get this passed? Congressman Gill lays out a couple of potential strategies. First is a classic political move. Attach the SAVE Act to a must-pass bill, like the one to fund the government, to basically force the Senate to vote on it. The second idea is a bit more dramatic. Force a talking filibuster, where Democrats would actually have to get on the Senate floor and argue against the bill for hours on end, live for everyone to see. So, after all that, where do things stand right now? Well, we're looking at a clear, head-on collision between the two chambers of Congress, with public opinion kind of hanging over the whole thing. Here's the bottom line. The House is expected to pass the SAVE Act. But once it gets to the Senate, it hits a complete and total roadblock. The political game to get around that is high stakes, and honestly, nobody knows if it'll work. It is a classic Washington, D.C. showdown, pitting the will of the House against the power of the Senate. And all of this, it brings us to the big, fundamental question at the heart of the whole thing. A question that every democracy has to wrestle with. When you're trying to make elections secure and make sure only eligible people are voting, where do you draw the line so you don't accidentally put up barriers that stop legitimate voters from being able to cast their ballot? Finding that balance between security and access, that's what the fight over the SAVE Act is all about.